Hello and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Empowering Women for the Green Transformation, hosted by the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, its Gender Expert Working Group, and the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. I'm Hannes McNulty, Green Industry Platform Manager with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP for short. This is the second webinar in the new series, Expert Insights to Support Effective Green Private Sector Development, organized jointly by GGKP and the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. Today's webinar will look at how greening the economy presents important opportunities to promote women's economic empowerment and improve gender equity. It also builds upon the key findings from the GGKP Gender Expert Group, which was launched in 2021 in collaboration with a number of internationally recognized organizations to provide both research and capacity building on gender-just transitions. Now, as we are very keen to adapt this webinar series to your needs, we really encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion in the dedicated Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. Please, as a result, make sure not to use the chat for your specific questions to the speakers, but rather use it for comments and discussion with the overall audience. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Ingvild Solvang, Head of Climate Change and Inclusive Development Unit with the Global Green Growth Institute. Ingvild has nearly 20 years experience working in international development and humanitarian affairs. Based in Southeast Asia for nearly 2 decades, she has responded to emergencies while also managing development programs for various organizations worldwide, always with a focus on poverty reduction, gender equality, and social inclusion. And of course, also worth mentioning is that she's the co-chair of the GGKP Gender Expert Working Group. So without further ado, please let me hand the floor over to you, Ingvild, to get us going.
Thank you very much, Hannes, for that lovely introduction. It is truly an honor to be here. As Hannes mentioned, my name is Ingvild Solvang, and I'm Director and Head of Climate Action and Inclusive Development at the Global Green Growth Institute, also co-chairing the Gender Expert Group on GGKP. And it's particularly exciting to be here today, supporting this event, which is hosted by the GIZ. So I would particularly want to extend my thanks to the GGKP and the GIZ for the opportunity to be here today. Now, it is also an event which is packed full of really, really talented speakers in the area of gender-just transitions and gender-responsive outcomes as we are progressing, hopefully, towards achieving the Paris Agreement and the solutions that we are offering to solve the multiple crises that we are facing us now in this post-COVID economic situation that we are in. So the challenges are many. And as we know, gender equality is an accelerator of sustainable development goals. We also know that gender equality is an accelerator of climate action and towards achieving sustainable outcomes. And now, according to the World Economic Forums, it would take us hundreds of years to close the gender gap at current pace. So the gender equality problem is a big one to solve in and of itself, not to mention in the context of the multiple planetary crises that is facing us. So embedding and integrating the gender into what we call the just transitions towards green and sustainable economies is really important. Now, we as an audience today, and me as a moderator, and the speakers today come towards these challenges from very different backgrounds as we are trying to come up with solutions. So I would like to talk a little bit about how we will structure the conversation. We will start first with a keynote presentation from my good friend and colleague at the International Institute for Environment and Development, the IIED, Dr. Simon Anderson, who is really a forward-leaning thinker in this space. He works in the IIED on gender equality issues and how they interlink with sustainable development universally. His work includes ways to transform experiential learning of sustainable development into evidence for policy, and he explores how to use realist approaches to learning at the interfaces of gender equality and universality. So he is one of the smartest thinkers I know on this subject, and we are very, very grateful to have him with us. So I will invite him to turn on his camera. And meanwhile, I would like to reach out to the audience that we have and introduce to you the opportunity that you have to use the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of the Zoom page, to send us your questions. I believe it is also possible for other participants to respond to questions, as we may not be able to tackle all the questions today. I hope that there is an active conversation also going on in the Q&A section there. And as we have time, we will come back to a Q&A towards the end of the session. So without further ado, Simon, please take the stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingvild. Your introduction has made me blush dreadfully. So it's not just the reflection of this room that's making my face red. It's your overly kind introduction. It's great to have this opportunity to discuss with everybody today these crucial issues. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can get started. And please, Ingvild, let me know if you can see the screen.
The screen is good.
Great. So in this framing opening piece, what I want to do is to start to address the question of, can green transformations and just transitions align pathways to low carbon economies and societies with substantive steps towards gender equality? I think that is still an open question. And this presentation has been prepared by Aung and myself, and May will be joining the panel later. These are the sources that we've used to pull together this presentation. There's a GIZ BMZ paper that has recently been published last week, Gender Just Transitions and Overview, which both May and myself contributed to. There's an IIED publication of a couple of years ago that looks at gender equality, just transitions, and informality. I want to also acknowledge the work of Nokwanda Maseko, who works with TIPS in South Africa, did some early work on the just transition approach and gender equality in South Africa. There's also been contributions from UNRIST, from Somali Studies, and Laura Turquette, and also Carol Colne and Claire Duncanson, who've looked at feminist engagements with Green New Deals. And I also want to acknowledge the importance of the work by Nancy Fulber on the rise and decline of patriarchal systems. All of those sources have influenced this presentation. So let's frame the issue. I think the best framing is provided by SDG 5, Target 5A. It says, give women equal rights to economic resources as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and natural resources. This was written at a time before we were mentioning gender equality and just transitions, but this was prescient. Unfortunately, the performance record that we've achieved globally towards Target 5A is rather poor. There are still discriminatory laws and social norms that remain pervasive, and women are unrepresented at all levels of political leadership, and this includes leadership that's towards just transitions and green economies. There is a global aspiration towards green transformations stated by ILO and UN Women, but the reality is that the political economy, as Nokwanda Maseko has pointed out, is largely causing there to be a lack of gender equality and intersectional equality achieved through just transitions. Nakwanda states that adapting or mitigating climate change impacts and impacts of related policy responses requires resources that are largely gained through the participation in formal employment and access to wealth. Women are underrepresented in the paid labor force and overrepresented in unpaid care work. This leaves them without the necessary resources for survival. And this is the political economic realities that I think we need to address. In the paper that I've mentioned previously that we did at IIED, we looked at several programs that include just transition and low carbon economy ambitions and objectives. Many of them are failing to include gender equality as an equal objective and a policy objective. The just transition strategies that we reviewed are not succeeding even in terms of a narrow approach to incorporating gender and related green jobs and the care economy. So in that paper, we found that there is the need to integrate a broader feminist critique of just transitions, one that will look at global justice and economic justice and look at what is really the root causes that are challenging the inclusion of equality within just transitions. Not only should we frame the challenge, but I think we should challenge the framework. As Nancy Folborough has pointed out, patriarchal influence may be weaker now, but it is still persistent. She calls for a general theory of economic justice that would apply to green transitions as well. Carol Cole and Claire Duncan have pointed out two things. Firstly, that to transform the structures and the root causes underlying the interconnected crises that we're facing, those of inequality, climate change, and biodiversity collapse, we need to go beyond the demands for simple inclusion of diverse women and for gender equality. They call for the use of feminist analytical tools that will enable us to question received wisdom and make visible the ways in which gendered meanings play a formative role in shaping the concepts and paradigms that constitute our worldviews, including our worldviews of low carbon transition. Nakwanda Maseko has called for a beginning of a discussion of what gender just transitions really means, and to begin it now. There are emerging opportunities. We can see feminist foreign and development policies coming not only from Germany, BMZ, but also being formulated in Scotland. There is increasing attention to the centering of care, an absolutely crucial component of how we will achieve gender equality through just transitions and low carbon transformations. There are also, more recently, the emergence of what are called eco-social contracts for the poly-crisis. And within these, there is, to some extent, the emergence of gendered justice as a key objective. So there are emerging opportunities that I think we can grasp hold of. Some of the examples of the way that gender just transitions can be applied in planning, and now to get to a more practical level, these include understanding and addressing the nuanced needs using feminist tools, including gender audits, gender impact assessments, and gender analysis, so that we can improve the understanding of gendered impacts, both of green interventions, but also green policies and just transition strategies. Governments and industry need to strive together to improve women's well-being in the workplace, and this will include considerations of centering care within the ways that different economic sectors develop. There's also the need to recognize that the inequities across the globe are based on context-specific cultural, political, and socioeconomic factors. So blanket just transition policies that are taken from north to south will not necessarily be appropriate. Gender just transition policies must strive to reduce the burden of care on women. Policies to address this could improve child and elder care within society. We also need to design inclusive planning processes that will be crucial for meaningful participation and to avoid power asymmetries in the development of just transition and green transformation. Finally, we need to recognize and strengthen institutions that represent women and marginalized groups, including trade unions, grassroots women's organizations, and activist groups. Some time ago now, IIED colleagues developed this framework for assessing the gender equality outcomes from just transition processes. This is a stepwise decision-based process. It is a framework that we hope people will use not only to understand what just transition processes and green transformations are achieving, but also, and more importantly, to leverage the ambition towards gender equality ambition. So there are pathways that we can hopefully will be hearing about now from the other speakers. We want to hear about economic empowerment. We want to hear about the use of safety nets that will support women, the most vulnerable women, through the processes of green transitions. We want to hear about centering care, the redistribution of resources, and the recognition of the value of care work. We want to look at how local environments will involve local environment management, will be included in just transition processes, and will be driven by women as main protagonists. There is a need to accept and to support collective action, inclusive coalitions. There's the need for engagement at agency. There's also the need at a higher level for policy agendas that are fully informed by the benefits that, as Ingvild has referred to, that the accelerator of gender equality can bring. We need to be honest and realistic about the structural enablers that are not yet present for women and intersectional, or gender and intersectional equality to be achieved. And we need to look at ourselves and all others and society in terms of the norms and discrimination that are actually leading us at this current time not to be including gender equality adequately in our just transition strategies. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon. That was lovely. That was a really good overview, and I think an ambitious vision for gender in just transitions. And I think that's exactly what we need, and a really good way to get us started thinking about how we can achieve not just ambition in terms of the environmental and climate outcomes that we need to see in the very near future, but also how we at the same time can push on a scale of ambition also gender equality as we move towards this green transition. And now I am very, very happy to introduce all our panelists. And I will ask them all to turn on their cameras so we can see them all. Great. Now we have Aung, who also works for IIED, and she also supported Simon's preparation of the presentation today, and also one of the leaders of Just Transition with IIED. So we are very happy to have her here today. We have Amar Gokhale, who is a partner of Intellecap, working on, or leading rather, gender practice across South and Southeast Asia and East Africa, very much focused in his work on women's economic empowerment, entrepreneurship, and gender smart investments. So welcome to you also, Amar. We have Nina Kolibashkina, who is the Senior Social Development Specialist at the Climate Investment Fund. She works passionately, I would say. I know Nina very well now, and she is very passionate about gender. And she is now, I would argue, very much in the context of the renewable energy and the green energy, the transition past coal, a global leader on the promotion of women's leadership in the just transitions. So welcome to you also, Nina. We have Valentina Belesi, who is a policy analyst in the Green Finance and Investment team at the OECD, where she conducts a lot of research and analysis on sustainable and transition finance. And she has focused a lot on how finance and financial instruments can integrate the gender component along with the green. She also coordinates and manages the annual flagship OECD forum on green finance and investments. So lovely to have you here, Valentina, as well. So let's stop and dwell a little bit at Simon's presentation. There was a lot of information there and a lot of ambition. Now, my experience working on just transitions is that it is sometimes a hard sell. It is sometimes a difficult sell to bring in the gender element beyond ticking the box. So I would like to ask you, May, why is the gender lens important in just transition, basically? Because I think understanding the importance of it is key to also be able to bring in the ambition for it.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you to all the participants for joining from all around the world. I see a lot of participants from Southeast Asia and at least one person from Myanmar, so hello to the fellow Myanmar person. I think that just transition, and particularly gender just transition, is a hard sell, particularly for countries in the global south who don't understand this phrasing of a just transition. And drawing from Simon's presentation, I'd like to highlight why gender is such an important lens, particularly for the global south. So in Simon's framework, there was a question of scale, and using a gender lens is really important for considering all those marginalized at different scales. So we have the North-South divide, and the just transitions conversations and discourse have very much been centered around conversations from the North, with a strong focus on the extractive sector, strong focus on formal workers. But as citizens of the global south, we can take a gender lens to take the just transitions framing back into our own hands by thinking of an approach that takes into consideration the scale of the formal and the informal. And so while the interventions on just transitions in the global north have been around formal, looking at compensation policies or uniting workers, us from the global south, we can benefit a lot from the informal lens that gender can provide us. And most of our workers are in the informal sector. Most of our women are care providers, providing care informally in the household. And those kinds of perspectives can really, really bring out the kind of interventions that we need in the global south.
Lovely, thank you very much. And let me right away take a question from the audience here from Monique Frey, which is also for you, May, which is around what type of inputs or what type of practical considerations, I guess, do we need to achieve equity in the green transformation framework in terms of gender outcomes?
So I can just continue a little bit from the conversation around the formal and informal framing. So the formal framing can give us practical considerations around what we can do in the workplace, and a lot of corporations and organizations have started thinking about this. So this is things like implementing a gender policy in the workplace, implementing flexible working hours, or assessing a gender pay gap. But we know that for the informal economy, that is not going to work. And informal considers those that are, like I mentioned before, women and the care burden that they provide. Is there a way to recognize the care that people provide and compensate them? That's a practical consideration. There are also a lot of informal workers in the global south working in fossil fuel sectors. They are working on the margins of companies, working to collect coal from overburdens, selling food to coal miners, that are at the very periphery of formal sectors. And how do we bring these informal people in? That is something that us in the Global South, we really need to strongly consider, and a gender lens can help us to identify their needs so that they don't get left out in the transition towards a low carbon future.
Thank you very much, May. Now let me turn to you, Amar, from the perspective of women's economic empowerment and enterprise development specifically. And I think May touches upon something really important here, which is kind of those opportunities that are happening on the margins or at the center of the just transition, or the transitions, I should say, and along the value chains of the transitions. So what role do you see enterprise support programs play to align the women's economic empowerment agenda with the green agendas?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ingvild. And I believe that the private sector can really be a strong driver for achieving both these agendas, and green enterprises that work in sectors or geographies which hold the potential for women's economic empowerment might or might not be aware of the ways to explicitly, affect these this empowerment, and especially small enterprises might lack the capacities and the resources to explore these pathways, and that's where enterprise support programs come in. Programs that are specifically designed to work on the nexus of gender and climate can help these enterprises, uncover interventions that are good for business and also promote economic empowerment or women's economic empowerment. For example, businesses in the agriculture and clean energy sectors, especially in the Global South, hold significant potential for women's economic empowerment. And we at Intellecap are actually running a program where we are working with a cohort of such enterprises as part of a project supported by IDRC to conduct gender analysis of their operations and help them, incorporate a gender lens while they are supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. And on the other hand, there are sectors that already have displayed that they can be pathways to further the gender agenda and that hold significant potential to be greened, like the textile and apparel sector, for example. So I would say the green agenda and the women's economic empowerment agenda are kind of mutually reinforcing. And I would even go one step further and say that the gender agenda should be by default a key driver of the green agenda, given that climate change disproportionately affects women and girls.
Thank you for that answer. And I like this idea of this interlinkage between the green agenda and the gender agenda. And I saw even a thumbs up flying across the screen here from the audience. So that's excellent. Now, if we were to drill down a little bit about the type of support that businesses need. And I think what you're talking about is, on the one hand, provide opportunities for kind of women-led enterprises to understand the business opportunities in the so-called green agenda, while also supporting businesses in achieving gender outcomes on the other end of it. So what type of support do we need to provide to enterprises to achieve both these agendas?
Right. And I would just like to clarify that these might be women-owned or they might not. The important part is that they are contributing to gender equality and they are contributing to the green agenda. And broadly speaking, businesses need, capital, knowledge, and networks. I've already spoken about, gender-aware technical assistance. But in addition to that, businesses also need gender-aware and patient capital, given that gender transformation is a slightly long-term process. They also need appropriate, measurement frameworks. We speak about the impact to be had on the gender front and on the climate front, but unless it is appropriately measured, there is only so much interest and mainstream capital that can be attracted towards it. So they need ways to measure that impact, and they need networks to benefit from this whole process, to disseminate their learnings and to shine the light on the benefits of supporting such enterprises and initiatives for a wider group of funders, for development practitioners, and indeed policymakers. I think we've heard about the importance of policy before. So I would say that they need these networks to effect all of this.
Yes, and let me just hold on to one of the words you said there, Amar, which was measurements and how we measure and what we measure, and linking that back to the outcomes framework that was introduced and presented by Simon, and also some of those outputs or results that may also talk about. I mean, it's a wide agenda when we talk about achieving gender equality. So what kind of success would we be able to measure?
Right. So it's important to attach value to both the breadth and the depth or the nature of impact that such interventions or these businesses have. And over the years, impact investors have increasingly adopted, metrics that measure reach or the breadth, the number of women reached, engaged, served by businesses, employed, or either directly or indirectly in the value chains. However, measuring depth is a more qualitative and a more expensive process, and stories on the ground really need to be brought forth to appreciate the nature of impact. And this impact can be very business specific. So when it comes to quantitative metrics like numbers, they can be generalized, but when it comes to more qualitative metrics, they tend to be very specific to the enterprise. So I'll just very quickly give one example where we worked with an enterprise that was providing fish feed for fish farmers in Kenya, and the farmers were selling this fish to women to be sold in the market, and there was a thriving fish for sex trade that was happening. But this business, since it was kind of an intermediary, had a chance to impact that by playing the role of buying the fish directly from the farmers and selling it itself to the women, so that there is no informal interaction between these women buyers and the fish farmers. So this is something that was very specific to this business, and we kind of came up with this idea only after we did a more detailed analysis. So like I mentioned earlier, it can be a slightly more involved and expensive process, which is why we see many investors talk about numbers, their reach, but not their depth so much. And I think that's what we need to change.
Involved and expensive, you say, and I think those are key words, and I love the richness of the example that you provide here. But again, the practicalities of what's very involved and what become then expensive in terms of transaction costs is something to really keep in mind. And let's go back and hear another. So back to you, May. From your experience and from the examples that you may bring of where we have been able to merge these agendas as well in your work, in ways that then become practical and implementable.
Sorry, would you mind asking me the question again on which what we're merging?
Yeah, the green and when we are merging the green and the gender agendas. So in the transition, if you have an example from your experience of where you have seen some substantive impacts.
I would say that the green and the gender agenda are not necessarily complementary to each other. Sometimes I see that in the green agenda, there are 3 dimensions of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. And I think the gender lens falls into the social side, and a lot of green agendas have pushed forward without considering the social dimensions. This is repeated. And so I can't think off the top of my head of examples that have succinctly addressed all 3 dimensions of sustainability: social, environmental, and economic. Most often, I see that green development policies have pushed forward for a green growth agenda, still going for growth, still relying on existing models of capitalism and growth, and not sufficiently addressing some of the issues of injustice that are the building blocks of everything else, of a healthy environment, of a strong economic foundation. So yes, I can't think of a practical example right now, but I do question the complementarity of these two agendas, the green and the social agenda.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point to make, and an important point to make. And I want to draw attention to one of the questions that has come in also in the Q&A now from Griffin Longo, who talks about what are we doing to support Indigenous people in the context of the green transitions as well. And I think that speaks a little bit to what you were saying, May, in terms of the challenges to really fully and in deep practical ways be able to address the massive environmental and climate crisis that we have, while also significantly take into consideration those people that are really at the front line of the battle. So maybe, May, if you have a moment to type an answer there and respond to Griffin, that may be good as well. Meanwhile, I would like to turn to the other side of this conversation that we always need to touch upon, which is the finance and the flows of finance into the just transitions, and how we can use that flow to also maximize these social outcomes, as has been discussed by Amar, in terms of how that could work in women's economic empowerment and enterprises, while also highlighting that achieving the level of ambition that Simon talks about is difficult to achieve in the context of the E, S, and G that we need to focus on, like May pointed to. So Nina, if I may turn to you for a minute. I know that you have done significant work in trying to understand how the flows of finance can unlock and accelerate women's leadership in the green transitions. And you have PowerPoints, which is lovely. So I'll ask everyone to turn their attention to the screen for a minute. So the floor is yours, Nina.
I prepared a couple of slides, but I know the time is very limited, so I have to be very focused. So I work for climate investment funds, and it is basically a trust fund that sits within the World Bank, but provides concessional finance to the Multilateral Development Bank, to the World Bank Group, and the 6 regional development banks. And within that, my job is to ensure that social considerations in the investment projects that we finance, which majority of our $11 billion portfolio, majority of it are loans, but then we also have some technical assistance grants, and they go both for adaptation and mitigation. We have a number of sectoral programs. Within that, my job is to ensure that social, and specifically gender, is really a red line. And as CIF, and we've just recently celebrated our 15th year anniversary, we have kind of went through an evolution of what do we understand by gender integration. We started modestly with just, the basic stuff of ensuring that there are enough women beneficiaries, ticking the boxes Ingvild was mentioning in her introduction remarks, moving to a little bit more systematic analysis of actual to markets and services, looking how all various investment programs can actually advance those objectives. But in line with the feminist development policies of a lot of our donors, and also commitment by the MDBs, we've been focusing lately more on gender transformative approaches and gender justice. And within that, actually in collaborations with colleagues from IIED and Gen Collaborative, we just very recently published a background report, which is a conceptual framework as well as it has a diagnostic tool. And basically, the objective of this is to reflect what can we do about women climate leadership. In the report, we define it as the ability of women to access and influence spaces where decisions about climate mitigation and adaptation are made, to ensure that gender equality considerations are incorporated into those decisions and structural barriers to equality are removed. And when I was listening to Simon's presentation, and we were engaging with Simon in this process as well, basically our task has been to translate some of the more radical feminist agendas into the language where the practitioners, the technical experts within the multilateral development banks that work on energy and agriculture can understand and really apply to their work and to their practice. I have a link, and I'll share it in the chat to the background document, where we just tried to provide this really comprehensive approach to both analysis of the gaps and power structures, identifying the barriers, but then based on that analysis, developing policy and programmatic responses. So the framework that we're talking about is looking kind of in three domains, within state, within private sector, and within civil society, looking as well as what are the gaps, and we know that still in terms of leadership representation, there are significant gaps in all three sectors, three domains. And then looking a little bit comprehensively at the various barriers, which include legal and policy frameworks, but also social capital, cultural norms, human capital, as well as intersectionality that Simon was also discussing in his presentation. And then we've tried to come up with a menu, obviously not all inclusive, of some suggested best practices that already exist and things that can be done, again, by different stakeholders, by state institutions and policymakers, by the private sector and the market, as well as by civil society, and things that can be done by all of them. I'm not going to go into the details, we don't have time for that, but would very much invite you to take a look at the report. And we make it a call for action for our colleagues who develop investment projects within the multilateral development banks to do kind of a three-step approach of the analysis, rather comprehensive analysis, design of practical interventions, but then as a number of previous speakers also reflected, monitoring. And that monitoring, both including really clear targets so that there is accountability, and the conditionality of financing would be that enough of it is directed to women groups, but also finding ways to include women groups and civil society organizations in oversight and evaluation of those type of interventions. I know I'm running out of time, so I wanted to very quickly move on to one practical example of how we're applying this more radical thinking in some of our programming. One of CIV's newer programs that was launched 2 years ago is accelerating cold transitions, and we're working in South Africa, Indonesia. The two countries are more advanced, but also in India, Philippines, and recently North Macedonia and Dominican Republic on this program. Within that wider program, we have set up a grant mechanism with funding from Canada for women-led cold transitions. And we're looking for ways to encourage and support MDBs to work directly with women groups, work directly with civil society organizations, and support women-led coalitions that could both work downstream with the local communities, empowerment, capacity building activities, but also play a bridging role of reflecting the voices of local women and communities at the national policy making in Indonesia. We're trying to now influence the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership discussion, with some recommendations for women leadership within the development of a broader investment plan for the country. So those are just very brief examples, but would be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Nina. And I've been following your work on the women's-led cold transition for a while. And I think maybe a follow-up question to you is again, selling the idea of women's leadership in the cold transition, knowing that the energy sector in many of these countries is a male-dominated sector, and it is a male-dominated sector also globally. Now, so I know a little bit about the model that you present now. It seems to be that you have this big funding called under the Accelerated Cold Transition envelope, and then you are designing a specific project to really bring in that element into it. So if you want to share just a little bit of the sort of the challenges and how you found those entry points to really push that agenda, assuming that it may sometimes have been a bit of a lift in terms of convincing stakeholders that it is important.
Sure. So I think it's really bringing what we're trying to do is bring the more radical perspective and CSO perspectives and voices into the conversations that are led by the policymakers and MDBs. Very, very often there is just no space, and that space needs to be created. And this is really our ambition, is to include it at kind of the most highest level. I think there are now a lot of lessons on how to do it on the ground, how to work with the enterprises. But the main argument with our Women Climate Leadership report is that structural issues need to be addressed. And who else, multilateral development banks in this regard are very well positioned. Our interlocutors are government officials, and we are able to influence policy reforms. So finding ways and finding quick wins and some simple approaches for that is how we're trying to do.
Great. Yes, I agree. Simple ways, while also getting to the involved and expensive that Amar was talking about. And now your presentation is in high demand, Nina. I'm looking at the comment section, and people are asking whether you can make that presentation available. So I'll leave you to consider that, and you get some applause across the screen. Amar, maybe you would like to look at the Q&A. There is a question there related to support to subsistent farmers, and maybe around the business development and enterprise development topic. And I would like now to go to Valentina as well, to zoom a little bit more in on the inevitable finance again. Finance. It is very important. And I know that you are quite passionately concerned, I would say maybe, about how we are integrating. So how do we integrate gender and environment in the ESG investment or sustainable finance? I know you also make a point to say that those two are different things. So ESG investments and sustainable finance, how do we go about this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. Indeed, last year I published an OECD policy paper on supporting women's economic empowerment through green policies and green finance. So as part of that report, I have analyzed how environmental and gender considerations are being integrated in sustainable finance approaches, whether it's ESG investment strategies or financial instruments. And here I'm now really talking about the climate finance space, so not the MDBs, not the climate funds, because indeed they are quite more advanced in integrating gender into their green and climate finance interventions, but really more of the private markets and private institutions. So, for example, I looked at the methodologies that are used to construct ESG ratings, so environmental, social, and governance ratings, that nowadays many investors and asset managers, financial institutions really use quite a lot to construct their portfolios and really guide their investment decisions. And the way that gender is integrated is very scattered. We see some gender metrics under the S pillar, some gender metrics under the G pillar, nothing under the E pillar. So there's no gender disaggregated data or indicators for environmental related metrics. And many of these methodologies are also either not available or not very transparent on what actually do you mean by E or S or G, and what precise indicators are tracked. So I think one way to kind of overcome this is to continue the development of these ESG ratings and metrics to better integrate gender. And this can start with very simple steps, which is collecting more gender disaggregated data on data collection efforts that are happening anyways. So it's just a matter of slightly improving those data collection efforts that are already happening. So that's I would say that's one sphere that would apply to both the ESG ratings providers and users, as well as the policymakers who are now starting to regulate this space a little bit more.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, I mean, one of the questions that has come in is about what type of financial instruments are currently available, and where are the gaps and the challenges in this financial ecosystem. I also believe that you have some thoughts about how we would answer such a question.
Yes, so in the analysis I've done in the report, I've kind of distinguished two types of buckets of financial instruments. There's those that are already gender labeled, so that exclusively and explicitly focus on gender. Those already exist. There's a wide range of examples, both in the fixed income space, if you think about gender bonds, for example, or gender loans, as well as in the private equity venture capital space with like gender funds, gender impact funds that already exist. And that's great. It's growing. We see that it's growing. But I think if we then look at where the money is really going, it's the rest of the financial system, essentially. And so it's important also to try and get across the message that gender considerations can be considered in any type of financial instrument, whether it's already gender labeled or whether it's a simple loan or a simple credit line. But so the second bucket of instruments that I've analyzed is those sustainable finance instruments that are not explicitly gender labeled, but that could integrate gender dimensions. And here I'm really thinking about gender bonds, for example, green bonds that actually attract most of the funding in the sustainable debt market. And if you look into that, there's almost no example of a green bond that also integrate gender considerations. So as simple as that, starting to actually think about women whenever designing the eligibility criteria of green bonds, which nowadays are quite well established. And there's another instrument, and I'll go briefly about this. There's more analysis in the report. One instrument that is gaining a lot of traction recently is sustainability-linked bonds and sustainability-linked instruments. Those are different from green or gender bonds. Those are general purpose, so corporate finance, let's say, instruments. And these can actually include a wide variety of targets, whether environmental, social, governance targets. And from my analysis, I think it was only 8% of sustainability-linked bonds and 3% of sustainability-linked loans, or vice versa, that actually have a gender target. So very little. And I think there as well, there's an opportunity to better think about these two dimensions together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Valentina. Now, the multiple dimensions that we need to tackle here, and back to Simon's first presentation as well. And I don't know, maybe it's not for you, Simon, this question. There is a question from the audience which speaks about the fact that if we do look at this from the perspective of changing social norms in order to tackle sort of the gender equality issue, so focusing specifically on the kind of the softer element of social norms, that can be beneficial for the transition, and it can accelerate the transition. So maybe it is a question, I don't know if it is for you, Amar, or May, or Simon. I'll ask the question first, and if anybody would like to come in. How important do we think that social behavior or changing of norms, social norms, let's stick to social norms, how important do we think that is in the just transition?
If I may come in very quickly, I think it's very important. And I think we've also heard a lot about the care economy from multiple speakers, and how it's important to address that as we go into the just transition. And we've been working on that topic as well. And that's where that's another place where the social norms and behavior change becomes extremely important, because enterprises can undertake some interventions that can help gender integration while making a just transition, but ultimately they have to be sustained and supported through longer term behavior change at the community level, at the family level, at the household level, and even at the level of the institution of marriage, if I may say that. So this behavior change is extremely important, and that is where the private sector needs allies like women's rights organizations or NGOs that work on the field with communities to make sure that this just doesn't become a business intervention, but it also is accompanied by a more community or a social intervention so that some of these changes are sustained.
Now, that would have been the perfect ending to the whole session, just how you summed that out, that the transition doesn't just become a business, but that it actually integrates also the just and the social and the communities. And maybe with that, I would like to ask a final question to you, Simon. What is at stake if we don't get this right?
I think a quick answer to that is the synergies that we've been identifying between gender equality, intersectional equality, and green transformations. Those are at stake. And we would be doing a huge disservice to ourselves and globally if we don't find ways of not only identifying but actually making those synergies happen. I think history tells us that we haven't, as a global population, been very good at finding synergies, and I would like to sort of echo Amar's call for, in a sense, new alliances that can actually not only help us identify where these synergies are, but to make them happen. So the synergies are at stake. We're already moving into a post 1.5 degree world. The need to find synergies that help us to overcome the increasing inequalities that are prevalent, not only gender inequalities, need to be addressed. And in terms of the social norms, I must say that the work that I've been involved in Ethiopia and elsewhere, where women's empowerment has been the main objective of interventions. There was a lot of curiosity to see how the social empowerment and the economic empowerment, how those two things could be made to work together, and whether they should be in series or in parallel. Now, there aren't blanket answers to that question. They're all the answers are going to be context specific. But I really do believe that the new alliances that we can form between green transformation and gender equality ambitions, and gender and intersectional equality ambitions, will be the way forward.
Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to also to close the panel today. So these alliances, I think, are very important, and as we know, and as has been hinted at by Simon, now we are at that critical moment in time. I think COP28 in Dubai is going to be very interesting as the conclusion of the global stocktake to how we are performing in terms of achieving the Paris Agreement. And I think we are hoping to see that the COP28 really becomes a COP for course correction. We need to get back on track on achieving the Paris Agreement and tackling the climate crisis, while I hope that all our panelists today have made it abundantly clear that the linkage to gender equality is an accelerator of achieving that as much as it is a right in and of itself. So again, maybe closing it with Amar's words, let's not turn just transition just into a business, but into a real and true collaboration between private sector, public sector, us as organizations, and definitely last but not least, the communities, and particularly those at the forefront of the transition. So with that, I want to thank the panelists for being with us today, and thank you all participants for very engaged questions online. I would like to also remind everybody to keep an eye up for the third webinar in this series organized by GGKP, GIZ, and partners, particularly the Donor Committee for Enterprise and Development. And the focus on the third session is going to be on supporting companies go green. So have a lovely evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Well done.